All right, good morning, class. I'm getting back into it. Actually, it's almost afternoon, all right, straddling that line here. I'm going to get back to you and cover some of the comments that I didn't quite get to today in class as we were talking about the ancient classical civilization of the Olmec. Actually, maybe I shouldn't say classical. They're probably actually pre-classic. Most historians think of the classic era beginning really with the early Maya. Anyway, we won't get too into those details. But we're talking, as I mentioned, we went over this in class, identifying the Olmec region, some of the ceremonial city centers, such as La Venta, San Lorenzo, are the two principal ones that we focused our attention on in class. And I'm just going to click through these comments because we've already made them together in class. If you want to pause this, of course you can to brush up your notes. We talked about some of the principal innovations that the Olmecs made. Again, one of the nicknames of Olmec civilization is the mother culture, meaning so much of Mesoamerican culture that emerges bears many of the footprints of early Olmec influence. And we left off today starting to talk about Olmec society, and I pointed out that one of the, just as Egypt is well known for its pyramids, Olmec society is known for these incredibly large and heavy basalt headstones. It's hard to tell the scale of this piece here. You can maybe tell a little bit with the palm fronds in the background there, but this piece would weigh several tons and would probably be the size of, say, a van, like a cargo van, actually probably a little bit bigger. But anyway, these monuments, these big, large heads are found throughout the Olmec heartland, so throughout that area of south central Mexico today. And they're a little bit of head scratchers. We don't fully understand what their purpose was. We think they were to honor important Olmec kings who also would have had priestly functions and priestly qualities about themselves. But you can see that these go back to even the early Olmec. In fact, there are some heads that even precede the Olmec period. I believe I read yesterday the earliest ones date as far back as 3000 BCE. But needless to say, they really flourish, this practice, during the Olmec period. And the other thing that's remarkable about them is that in many cases we see these large monolithic chunks of basalt rock that are then carved and shaped into these head figures, but they exist far from the most naturally occurring basalt quarries. So the challenge of getting these monuments into place is a whole separate story that breeds fascination about the Olmecs. What do these heads suggest? Well, oddly enough, they tell us a little bit about Olmec society because obviously the engineering and labor required to move this sort of rock, to trade for this sort of rock, to shape and carve this sort of rock all involves a division of labor. And so one of the things that we trace from these really curious features of Olmec culture is something of their society as well. And we believe that the earliest elites that formed, and it's out of these elites, the surplus that allows these elite classes to exist around these ceremonial city centers, we believe they probably developed their power and control through their ability to limit access to things like water and stone. And so fundamentally through this ability to manipulate key resources of the Olmec heartland, we see the emergence of this early elite society. And we know that the rulers were also religious. They had religious value to the people that would come and pay homage at these ceremonial city centers. The bottom bullet there talks about how even though there were these early there's this early evidence of society, it wasn't terribly complex. Like this is nothing like, say, Athens. It's not as sophisticated as Zhou era China. Really not much evidence of standing military, although a little evidence of obsidian arrowheads and tools, but nothing on the scale to suggest that the Olmec were particularly militarily minded. And there was no like separate priestly caste. The priests were oftentimes, so you know, the priestly functions were oftentimes served by the people who led a given ceremonial center. Olmec religion, moving on here, this is actually a relief of a feathered serpent, which was a very common god and deity that was among the handful of gods that the Olmecs paid homage to. We think of the Olmecs of having a pantheon or a menu of gods that was at least 10 in number. There were some that tended to be particularly important, like the rain god, the feathered serpent god, fire god, sun god, so on and so forth. And part of our basis for concluding that the Olmecs had a fairly vibrant religious culture was that we see evidence, once again, we see evidence of the Olmec gods and the Olmec carvings and images in many of the later Mesoamerican civilizations. So that's fairly strong proof that the Olmecs were practicing religion and probably doing it in a way that is consistent with something of what we observed in the later Maya, the later Aztec, Teotihuacan, so on and so forth. The rulers, we've already sort of touched a little bit about this when we were talking about art, and to a lesser extent when we were talking about society, but the kings, the rulers of these, of Olmec cities and ceremonial city centers, oftentimes connected and linked themselves to the natural hierarchy and order of the natural world around them. And so, for example, not only did these kings hitch their authority to that of the gods that the people worshipped, but they also usually symbolized their authority by using things like jaguar pelts, jaguar teeth, jaguar tails. Similarly, they might use quetzal feathers. The quetzal are these very, or I should say still are, these very beautiful, colorful birds of the Central American rainforests. So Olmec religion was very tied also to the social hierarchy of the civilization societies that emerged in these ceremonial centers. The feathered serpent is a god, again, that's depicted here in this relief carving. But it's also worth noting that this feathered serpent has had many other names that have emerged, and among those, this feathered serpent is also the god of Quetzalcoatl, which was a god that was important to the Aztec. And those of you who know a little bit of the story of not Pizarro's, but Cortez's, the Spanish conquistador who first enters Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital of the Central Valley of what's today Mexico, there is some legend that helps explain why the Aztecs welcomed Cortez, and part of that story involves the god Quetzalcoatl, that quite possibly the Aztecs thought that Cortez was this feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, who was predicted to arrive around the time that the Spanish entered into Tenochtitlan. And the jaguar also plays a very critical role in Olmec religious ceremony. There's a very common motif or recurring theme in Olmec art that shows leaders and humans hitching themselves to the jaguar. So the Weir jaguar is this half human, half jaguar, half nature, half natural item. We call them nahuales. The jaguars are very unmistakable motif. Bloodletting and sacrifice, this is a little tricky for us to determine, but we do have evidence that there was some level of bloodletting that took place in Olmec society, and our basis for this is that we see in many cases tools such as the one here. This is a, it looks like a spine. It is actually a jade tool, but it was actually pretty common for the residents of the Olmec heartland to use stingray spines, which were, stingray being a sea creature. Sometimes they would use thorns, and the idea was to draw blood and to offer that blood as a sacrifice to the gods of the Olmec pantheon. Now, we have to be a little careful here. We have much clearer evidence when we get later on to the Maya and the classic era of the Maya. We know that they engaged in widespread bloodletting. We could probably, by extension, reach some conclusions about how the Olmec thought about bloodletting, but we should be a little bit careful. But I will say that in later centuries, bloodletting was largely a practice undertaken by the nobility, the elites within society, because it was believed that their blood was more valuable to the gods. And so whether it was bloodletting certainly happened. Human sacrifice is a little bit more difficult to tell. Even later, the Maya aren't going to be huge practitioners of human sacrifice. There will be some of that, but it'll become particularly evident later on with the Aztec. Human sacrifice was practiced on a very widespread scale. Okay, so moving on, I'll just stop, and those of you who were in class today know that one of your tasks was to compare and contrast the civilization of the Olmec in Mesoamerica with some of the civilizations that we had discussed earlier in the week. And I am looking at some of your cards right now in front of me, and I'll be grading them momentarily. But have a good weekend, and we will pick up on Monday with a theme that we'll be pursuing throughout next week. Thank you.